I want to move over now to my a few additional thoughts from my talk last night about the idea of truth. So let me repeat a little bit from last night. What I've discovered in attending Jewish studies courses here, and certainly from all my experience teaching, back in the States, is that people have concepts in their mind that impede them from, I think, certain kinds of spiritual, intellectual development, and maybe even moral development. And that's, as I would say, the use and misuse of the word truth. So, for example, people would say, this is my truth, that's your truth, as if truth is entirely subjective. You've probably heard this before. If you've used it, I want to warn you against using it. Because when people say my truth, there's at least three things going on. First of all, it's obvious that we experience truth subjectively. So if they mean I experience truth subjectively, I would say that's redundant of subjectivity. We experience everything subjectively. So anything that you see, you can say, well, I see a table, but that's my experience of the table. That's obvious because you are you, and you have a subjective world. So many people use the word my truth as a way of saying, I experience the world subjectively, which is unnecessary to say. It comes with being a human being. So we'll push that aside. Other times when people say my truth, they mean their perspective. I could say, for example, I think America is the greatest gift to humanity any nation has ever presented. Person would say, well, that's your truth. I think what they mean is that's your perspective. I prefer that's your perspective to that's just your opinion. I want to take the word just out, because as we start to approach the idea of truth more, one thing that a true statement has, if not verifiability, which means you can empirically verify it, but reasonability, which means you can talk about it in a reasoning way, a reasonable reasoning way. So from my perspective, any credibility of the word truth requires the idea of reasoning, and reasonability. If you can't reason about it, it might just be a false opinion, meaning opinion has nothing to do with what is true. Now, not everybody is as good as reasoning as others. You might have a person who's a sophist, the Greek idea of a person who can argue any point of view because they don't believe in any point of view. So clearly, there are very sophisticated, clever people who engage in sophistry, meaning proving things just because they're clever and smart. Another person who might have a very deep foundation of moral wisdom, but is just not very articulate. So I don't want to say that being able to reason well is a requirement for being a good person, because many people reason, but they're not good people and don't say true things. But in any case, all of us should be able to detect some claim that has no basis in reasoning, either because it's not empirically verifiable or it does not stand up to the scrutiny of reasoning. Of course, one thing in the back of my mind is the outrageous claims about the nature of the human being propagated by that very destructive point of view, which is this postmodern neo-Marxist farrago they call DEI. Now, I have to say, I'm in favor of diversity. I'm in favor of equity as fairness. I'm in favor of inclusivity. But the movement was not what those words said. Those words were actually red herrings to make you think about something else. Well, what they were really doing was propagating a postmodernist, neo-Marxian theory of history, of reality, of politics, and the human being, most especially dividing all of humanity into victims and oppressors, mostly by race, which of course serve the interests of those who are self-described victims. Now, how do I know this is not true? Go to any part of the globe. How does this theory work in China? How does it work in Rwanda? How does it work in Uzbekistan? They don't have this idea that there's victims and oppressors based on race. It's very located to what I'll call the issues of race and identity, mostly in the United States. So any truth that is geographically isolated is probably not true. Now, therefore, you take a step back and say, well, has there been slavery? Are there differences in class and race? Absolutely. Is it all accountable through the idea of victims and oppressors? And I would say no, because no one can demonstrate it. So part of something being true is not just claiming it, but demonstrating it reasonably. And here's one way you know that something is probably not true is if people refuse to reason, which means they make a claim, you question, you want to understand the reasoning process, and they refuse to reason with you. So they move beyond what I'll call reasoning into axiomatic statements. Okay, so now we're going to move to another area of truth, and that is the idea of our axioms. Now, I believe we should all have axioms, but not very many of them. Axioms, but not very many of them. So I'll share with you a few of my axioms, meaning I believe them to be true. Again, because they're metaphysical axioms, I can't demonstrate them empirically, but I can reason about them, and theoretically, I can be talked out of them. So, for example, I axiomatically believe that there are better and worse answers to moral questions, meaning I'm a moral realist. That's foundational for me because I think every other belief should be assessed by what it produces morally. If a belief produces a mistreatment of other people, victimization of the innocent, murder, mayhem, and even other kinds of ethical standards such as lashon hara, defamation, libel, etc. If one has a belief that permits you to act immorally, meaning you wouldn't want it done to yourself, we're going to go back to Hillel's rule. There's all kinds of maxims by which we can assess a moral statement. One of them being Kantian, is this a standard for all humanity? Hillel, what's hateful to you, don't do to others. Now, remember, these are all limited, but they're good places to start. So if anybody has a belief that says, because of my belief, I get to murder other people. Because of my belief, I get to victimize the innocent. Because of my belief, I get to spread libel and slander. There's no restraint on the way that I speak. It doesn't, therefore, match my axiom of moral realism. There are moral standards which we must obey, and any statement, any belief system that's claimed to be true that would have us deviate from the moral standard, I would say, I know you're saying it. I don't believe it to be true in any kind of metaphysical sense. So this is axiomatic for me. Now, I've had many people come to me and say, there is nothing that is morally real. Ever since the 16th century or so, people began to believe in moral relativism, the social construction of reality. All beliefs, opinions, including moral ones, are socially constructed. They don't have any reference to a metaphysical reality. So to say that's right is a way of saying, my culture thinks it's right. It's not really right. I'll tell you why that doesn't make sense to me. Because cultures, as far as I know, have never been univocal. So when it says, oh, that's just your culture, I said, my culture, there's a huge diversity of voices. So when you say my culture says it, I said, which one of the 20 different opinions that I know people think today? So my culture is unanimous on something. So when I say something is right, it's not because my culture says it's right, because my own culture is divergent on what is right. So clearly, I'm part of one, let's say, element of my culture. So instead of saying what you think is right is from your culture, because it's not, because my culture is multivocal, they might say, well, there are many perspectives on what is right in your culture. Why would you agree with this group of people? For example, the group that believes that human rights refers to something metaphysically real. Many other people say rights do not refer to anything metaphysically real. It's just a made-up word. And other people, like me, and let's say my group, believe that the word rights refers to something real. My culture is in disagreement with itself. So anybody who says our beliefs and opinions come from our culture, either that's obvious, meaning of course there's a culture, but the culture itself is divergent. So people are avoiding the real question is, since you live in a multivocal culture, what is your reasoning that you identify with one voice in your culture? So the idea that our beliefs and opinions come from our culture is either shallow, or absurd, okay? Because culture is so multivocal. Even in a religion, you know, I consider myself an authentic participant in the Jewish religion. My beliefs and my opinions don't, as it were, come from Judaism, because in Judaism, there's such a spectrum of beliefs and opinions about most things. So if someone says, well, that comes from your religion, right? So when we talk about, for example, the claim that all truth is socially constructed, it's either a shallow statement or it's an absurd statement, can't be in any way sustained. So when one gets past the idea of socially constructed truth, which again is either shallow or absurd because their cultures are diverse in what they think, correspondence theory of truth, which I think is, again, has nothing to do with our metaphysics, we come down to our axioms. So I was sharing that an axiom for me, which I claim to be true, is moral realism. And I would encourage all of you to have that axiom. When you have the axiom that there are better and worse answers to moral questions, doesn't mean that you know the answer, but you believe the answer is worth searching for. The response to that is, since we can't demonstrate an answer, there is no answer, which is, of course, an absurd statement. The fact that I don't know an answer does not mean that there is no answer. So when a person says, there is no real answer to a moral question, that's an axiomatic statement. One person's axiom is, the word right, true, good don't refer to anything metaphysical. They're just words that refer to my own opinions or some part of my culture. That's axiomatic. So oftentimes we who are moral realists, a person says, prove it. And I say, prove your axiom. So axioms, remember, from a reasoning perspective, are even. I can't prove that the word right, in a moral sense, refers to a metaphysical reality. And they can't prove that the word does not refer to a metaphysical reality. We're just going to call that even. I hope you can all see that. So if someone says to you, prove moral realism, you can say, prove that morals don't refer to a metaphysical reality. Just call it even. Not worth arguing, not worth discussing. I really want to make this clear. It is not worth arguing or discussing with a person whether there are better and worse answers to moral questions, for two reasons. You won't get anywhere. There are just some people that like to argue. I don't recommend it. The second thing is, they're not sincere. They're not sincere. And here's how I know. I'll take you on a couple of steps. So I've been around long enough that I remember the advent of what's called postmodernism, the idea of which was to deconstruct the edifice of Western thought and make room for example, the interests of racial equality, women's rights, etc., meaning this edifice of Western thought, which had been oppressive of people on the margins, the marginalized. They tried to say, well, the entire edifice is wrong. So postmodernism has a kind of a vertigo. Nothing's right, nothing's wrong, but they didn't mean it. Because the minute the postmodernist has a place at the table, they start talking about rights, women's rights, racial rights, whatever rights people talk about, which means first is to weaken the edifice, come in, and then claim that the edifice is actually real, but it only applies to them, typically reading out someone else out. So if someone says rights is a made-up word, for example, find what they care about, and suddenly it's a real word. Meaning it's a word that refers to something real. When a person says women's rights, transsexual rights, racial rights, and so forth, they don't mean, but the word rights is not real, doesn't refer to anything. I mean, they don't add that part. They talk about it if it's real. You know, there's one person I have in mind who wrote a book where the person said, all this talk of rights and morals, it's just so much socially constructed rubbish, bourgeois thought systems, and just kind of poo-pooed the whole thing. You know, his intellect made him above the whole thing. You know, when the opposition to the judicial reforms was happening in Israel, I'm not taking a stand, I'm just saying there were judicial reforms, there was opposition. The person got up and spoke like a raging prophet about it was wrong, it was evil. And I thought to myself, wait a minute, I thought you're the guy that said there are no real answer to moral questions, it's all just subjectively constructed. And now you're here telling us that there really is absolute right and wrong, and you're on the side of the right. So I just want to share with you is, when someone says there is no real right or wrong, find out what they care about, and they will back away from that very quickly. All right, so that moral axiom of mine. Another axiom of mine is the existence of the soul. Now, this is what propels some of my religiosity, and again, I want to offer this to you, that when you think about what are my axioms, what do I hold to be true and certain, emet ve'emunah, in this third Shabbat on the way to the high holidays, we should all have what I'm going to call our 3 to 5 axioms, that if someone said to you, what are your axioms, you can whip them out, right, in a second, from dead sleep. Someone wakes up and says, wait a minute, what are those axioms again? Well, I'll tell you right now. You should know them so deeply, you dream about them. First of all, moral realism. The second one is the existence of the soul. Okay? Now, by soul, I don't necessarily mean the eternal soul, but it's part of what I mean. By the soul, I mean some deep part of our humanity, not the Freudian unconscious, closer to the Jungian unconscious, where, paraphrasing James Hillman, meaning is created. A deep sense of self created. It's below our unconscious ego states. It's where values take shape. It's an alive part of the inner life that's always on a journey. It's not static, but in many ways, it shapes our lives. So I believe in the existence of the soul. And one reason I believe in the existence of the soul is because I've experienced it and I don't have another word for that experience. Meaning, once I go past what's happening in my unconscious ego self, positive ego states, negative ego states, and I go down and I go to core foundational experiences of myself, the core of my wounds, the core of my hopes, the core of my dreams, I can even go under that. And I tap into something that ever since I tapped into it, I call it often, the burning fountain, somewhere where the fire and the fire and the water of the divine flows into me in some deep, deep place. And when I've gone there, it's ultimate reality. I mean, sometimes that pushes me into mystical experience, deeply spiritual experience. Is not reducible to an emotional or feeling state. It's not reducible to my Freudian, even Jungian unconscious. Is something much more foundational. So moral realism, the existence of the soul, a place where meaning is created in an involuntary way, which means to my third axiom, that there's a connection between the conscious mind and the soul, that they work in a symbiotic relationship. Okay, so let me hold that as number 3, jump to 4, I'll come back to 3. Number 4 is there are better and worse ways to live, spiritually, morally, and by better and worse ways, I also mean ways of thinking, ways of feeling, ways of speaking, and ways of acting. Now, how do I know this? How can I demonstrate it to be true? It's axiomatic for me. So when someone talks about their hatreds, when someone talks about their resentments, I get it. I understand it. I'm a human being, but I know it's not sustainable for human flourishing. Now, for me, that's axiomatic. So part of what is axiomatic for me are there better and worse ways of thinking, and I'll jump to number 5. And we have a duty to flourish, which means change our ways of, our inner and outer behaviors to the model of the flourishing. So I know that the conscious mind and the soul are in conversation. I know that some part of me regulates that conversation to produce the good, and therefore I believe in the good. Let me try to wrap all this up. Emet ve'emunah, what do I know to be true and certain? Moral realism, for sure. The existence of the soul, which requires that the duty that I talked about the first Shabbat, which is self-knowledge, reflection. We have a soul, we should know the soul, which refers to my next one is, well, who is it that's knowing the soul? So clearly there's some kind of conscious self, but in the conscious self, there's something of a regulator. I believe this to be true. I have a soul, I have a higher consciousness. Okay? They should be in conversation with each other. And what does this conversation between consciousness and the soul produce? Certainly a clear understanding there are better and worse ways to live. So I believe it is true and real there are bad emotional habits. There are bad thinking habits. There are bad speaking habits. There are bad behavior habits. They're bad. Why are they bad? Because just dogmatically going back to moral reasoning, because they're not good. But on the other side, because they don't lead to human flourishing. I want you to think about this. These are my axioms. So when someone else proposes a belief to me, I say, well, do they believe in the reality of morality? Do they believe in the existence of the soul? Do they believe that we can be conscious of the soul? Do they believe that there is something in human consciousness where the higher self and the soul can be in conversation with each other, and we have a duty to regulate that conversation for the purpose of flourishing as human beings and producing the good? So those are my axioms. And then someone says, well, I believe this to be true. I think to myself, okay, let me check apart my axioms. And they say, Palestine free, river to the sea. Do you mean get rid of the Jews? Because we're going to fight back. So I don't know who you think is going to do this. If you're doing it, we're here. You want to get rid of the Jews in Israel, right? There are people who've been trying a long time. That's not moral. It's not moral when you say Palestine free that you mean the murder of every Israelis and everybody who lives here. If you don't mean that, what do you mean free of? The state of Israel? Okay. How's that going to happen? We're back to murder. We're back to atrocities. We're back to genocide. So I say to myself, that's actually not a moral statement. In fact, it's quite morally offensive if it implies the eradication of a state, the eradication of a country, of a people, so that you can spout a slogan which more or less amounts to virtue signaling. It's the way you join the, whatever the new agenda is, where you get to say slogans that imply murder, genocide, and destruction. It tells me they're not in contact with their soul. They're not reflective. They're not being moral. There's nothing in them that makes them think beyond spouting a slogan that helps them join some dubious club of people who are only known for the shallowness and immorality of their thinking. So I run a little criterion. I say, well, that doesn't add up. When a person says the world is divided into oppressors and victims, therefore what? Okay. Therefore, these oppressors, something bad should happen to them. We need to run them through a re-education program. I said, actually, I'm not with that. They should be. So everything that's happening in the world today, I run by these criteria. There are so many things that I can mention to you about when people claim that something is true, that I ask myself, what does it produce? So a last thing about this, I'm really tolerant of the beliefs of other people. So when I grew up Jewishly, there was a lot of hostility toward Christians in general and evangelicals in particular, because they had beliefs that people that did not agree with them are going to hell. Okay. And I thought, wow, you think I'm going to hell? It bothered me because I think because I was taught that it should bother me. Then I began to ask myself, do I believe in hell? Maybe. As Adin Steinsaltz said, we're already in hell. So if you want to know what hell feels like, we're here. Adin Steinsaltz says there are 10,000 levels of hell. We sometimes are in the first level of hell, not the thousandth level. But if you think this is anything but hell, you're not living a sentient life. I thought, well, that's pretty dour, but I think I get it. And sometimes, history takes us down to the 10th and 20th level of hell. So I think, well, I don't think I'm going to hell. Maybe hell's over on the next hill, but okay, so I don't think that's true. And they say, you're going to hell because you don't believe in Jesus. I said, well, I don't think that's true. And I'm not offended by it. I guess we'll find out. So I relaxed. I don't care what people believe unless I see the moral effect. If a person says, you're going to hell, and I want to hurry the process, now we have a problem. Because if you intend to do something about it, then of course we're going to have an issue. So whatever anybody believes, I mean, whether it's they believe in Rumpelstiltskin, they believe in they're Rastafarian, they're whatever, the evangelical Christian, whatever. So yeah. What are you going to do about that? I'm going to spread the gospel. Okay, anything else you're going to do about it? No, I'm just going to spread the gospel. I say, great, we're cool. So I judge a belief by what it produces, not the nature of the belief. And this goes back to my first my first criterion of the moral reality. Last thing I want to say, I want to mention something that really beautiful that happened last night, and that was the experience of truth. And very briefly, uh, again, when I read beautiful poetry, something in it sinks down and, as it were, hits some kind of inner criterion within me, in my soul, that says true. And I mentioned last night that I think that is mostly by my definition of God. So when people say, do I believe in God? As you know, I say I'm a God knower. I don't believe in propositional theology where I have 13 articles of faith, and if I believe them, I'm a good Jew, and if I don't, I don't. I ignore that. Religion for me is our rituals, our culture, our myths, our stories that give us a path through life. And in this this mythic symbolic culture, which encompasses and shapes my consciousness, there are moments of utter, deep, and profound beauty. And when I go to those moments of profound beauty through poetry, through studying Bible, through studying the prayer book, through my spiritual practices, it takes me to a place where, on one hand, it's just extraordinarily spiritually deep, so deep that the natural response is tears. And we sometimes cry when we're happy, we cry when we're sad, but we also cry when we hit moments of unbearable truth. Sometimes truth in and of itself, sometimes a tragic truth. So tears are in my way, is evidence that we've gone down to the core of the soul. Now, I read something extraordinary today. I went to a 2-day seminar at the local Institute for Hebrew Culture, that really great place, studying wonderful things. And the head of the institute, a woman named Ruth Calderon, gave a wonderful talk, and she went down a side avenue about whether God cries. Whether God cries. Very serendipitous, because I talked about it at 5 o'clock in the morning, and then I went over there today and she spoke about it. And it's a radical idea. I mean, people in class, but if God is omniscient and God is all powerful, how could God cry? She goes, okay, so because you have a theory, God doesn't cry. She took us over to the book of Jeremiah, chapter 13. Okay, I won't go there. Look at Jeremiah 13. God says, I cry. And God cries in a place called Mistorin, which sounds like the word mystery. And God cries because of the arrogance, and this is in the book of Jeremiah, the arrogance and pride of the people is leading them to destruction. We're going to put that aside. The Talmud then says, wait, does God actually cry? Is Jeremiah correct? And one rabbi says, but it says here, God is filled with joy and happiness and light and love. God doesn't cry. Another rabbi brings up something else and says, we have textual evidence that God cries. It maybe doesn't fit your theology, but the Bible says it so. So another rabbi comes to resolve and said, there's God's, as it were, person that God, the mask God presents to the world, like God on stage, and backstage, there's a chamber where God cries. Okay, now the whole room almost broke into tears at the same time. Okay, this idea that God cries, it's in the book of Jeremiah. And then, putting aside what Jeremiah said, is what makes God cry? I mean, it's a wonderful poetic image. And then the connection between the tears that we have when we experience an ultimate truth in poetry, in cinema, in music, where your only natural reaction is for tears to well up. Try to imagine. Again, I don't have any backup for this, but we hit tears because at that moment, God is in tears. And our tears and God's tears just match up for a moment. And we get ourselves together and go back to our external world. And God says, I got to shake that off. I got to be God. Got to go back to being God. And God's go back to this world. It's a poetic image. And that's what I want to talk. The last thing I want to say is this: the truth of poetic images. Is it empirically true? No. Is it correspondence theory true? Does the statement occur to a reality that I can verify? No. It's a soul truth. And therefore, as we grow as human beings, I think we should seek what I call soul truths that are mostly experienced in beauty. So I'm talking about love, justice, truth, and beauty, connection between truth and beauty. When we experience beauty, raw beauty in its most potent form, for me, mostly in literature, it creates what I call moments of truth. And those deep moments of truth is where I mostly experience the divine. And of course, from that comes the love of the divine, the experience of the divine love for us. And I think from that, a deep sense of compassion for other human beings as we all go through this path through life that is irrigated with human tears. And we suddenly, I think, come out compassionate, knowledgeable, sentiment, filled with our own grace. And the whole idea of this love, justice, and truth and beauty just for me, all folded into each other in my preparing for today.